We're now on the record. My name is Anthony DiMattia. I'm your videographer, and I represent Accurate Vision Incorporated in Granada Hills, California. This date is Tuesday, May 9th, 2006. The time is 9:08. The court reporter will now swear in the witness.
Raise your hand, please, sir. Do you solemnly swear testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the full truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Please proceed with the question.
So just to highlight quickly, some of you joined the company in 1990, and I understand you were elected to the board of directors in 92. That you you joined the company as the head of North American Pharmaceuticals, and then in 94 took over the whole pharmaceutical section of the company. In 95 you became chief operating officer, and in April of 2000 you relieved Mr. Leshley as the CEO, chief executive officer. And then Smithkline Beecham merged with Glaxo Wellcome, and then you became the CEO of the new merged company in January of 2001. Is that just about it?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. What month in 1990 did you join Smithkline Beecham?
I think it was September.
And just for the record today, whenever I mention the company, whether it be actually Beecham Laboratories was gone by the time you got there, but whether it's Beecham or Smithkline Beecham or Glaxo, GSK, SKB is about all I can think of now. I'll be speaking just of the same entity.
Sure.
And the same goes for Paxil, paroxetine, under any name that it might have, Seroxat or whatever. Is that okay too?
Sure.
Okay. Would you agree with me, Dr. Garnier, that if the figures in your April of 91 suicide report were technically inaccurate, that would be wrong for your company to submit?
If it was inaccurate, and sure, it would be a pity to submit it.
Okay, and it would be wrong to do that even if you could get it through the FDA inadvertently or whatever, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Now, in terms of the clinical trials, there is a term called washout or run-in phase. Are you familiar with those terms?
Yes.
Okay. And you understand those are phases. What's the purpose of a washout or run-in phase?
Well, sometimes patients take a medicine because they suffer from a condition. And as you are going to try a new medicine, you want to make sure that you can separate the effect of the new drug they're going to receive from the old drug they were taking. So to ensure that they have no more of the old drug in their system, you go through a run-in or washout period.
So that's try to make sure that all the patients who actually enter the randomized portion of the trial are on a level playing field?
As much as you can. I mean, there are others, yes.
Right. And you would agree that the adverse events that occur during the washout period could be from the person coming off another drug, or could come from a myriad of different causes, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that in terms of when you're looking at a clinical trial adverse events, you don't start counting them until the randomization period, is that correct?
Until the randomization period, yeah, that is correct.
Okay. And would you agree that a reasonable and prudent pharmaceutical manufacturer has a duty to warn prescribers of serious adverse events?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. And serious adverse event is actually defined on that last exhibit I gave you. Do you see it on the second page? I believe it defines a serious adverse event. And can you read those criteria into the record, please?
A serious adverse experience is any experience which is fatal, life-threatening, permanently or temporarily disabling, incapacitating, results in hospitalization, prolonged hospital stay, is associated with congenital abnormality, carcinoma, or overdose.
Okay. And would you agree, sir, that a death by a suicide would be considered a serious adverse event?
Yes.
Okay. And also a suicide attempt would be considered a serious adverse event?
Yes.
Okay. Now, a pharmaceutical company not only has a moral duty to warn, they also have a legal duty in this country, and probably most other countries, to warn about serious adverse events, correct?
Yeah, in the context of informing about the drug, yes.
Well, maybe I can clarify that. When the drug's approved for, let's say, Paxil, GSK is responsible for preparing the initial label, correct? And then the FDA can negotiate whether or not there's changes, correct?
Well, the company has a right to submit a draft
A proposed label.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that, of course, is just an initial draft, and then the FDA, they do their magic and they change everything, and it becomes the final label.
But the label is never really final. In fact, it's not a static document.
Right.
It's a growing document, correct?
That's correct. It
Okay.
evolves as we get more knowledge about the drug.
Right. And your responsibility increases as you get more knowledge about the drug to warn about serious adverse effects, right, that become better known.
Well, it's as important day one as it is, there's no difference
Okay.
before and after.
Yeah, it's always
We have to do that all the time. Yeah.
Okay. And in fact, you can change your label without even getting approval from the FDA. There's a law that allows you to do that, correct?
Yes, but in practice, you don't want to do that.
Okay. But you can do it if you want. The law allows that to occur.
Yes, but you do want the FDA to agree with the changes you're going to propose, because they have the power to correct what you just said the day before.
Okay.
Let's say we decide to inform physicians of some new event affecting our drug. Well, the next day the FDA might come back and say, well, we didn't like the way you did this, you have to redo it. So it's considerably disrupting. That's why most companies go through the FDA first, in practice.
Okay.
But you're right, there's a legal right for us to go directly to the public,
Okay.
which is rarely used.
Okay. Now, there's other ways that GSK can get warnings out to doctors too, correct? I mean, other than the label, because they have a sales force who visit doctors. That's one way. If GSK wanted to get the information to doctors, they could do it through the sales force, correct?
You can't separate the two. If it's an important fact, it's going to get into the label, and then the label will be, advocated to the physicians or shown to the physician in different ways, including with the sales force.
Right. And it
They
could,
don't operate independently, you know what I'm saying?
well, I know that now, recently, GSK did send to the FDA a proposal to change the label to increase the warning about suicidality with regard to young people and even adults, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I assume you're waiting to see whether or not the FDA is going to approve that new language?
Well, in this case, we have already had interactions with the FDA. That's why we released a letter.
Okay. So the FDA approved the...
Informally, they did, yes.
Okay. So now there's a label change. How does that get out to the prescribers around the United States? Just take the United States.
Well, we have to, in this case, I think we write to every physician in America.
Okay, but do you attach the new label so they get it?
I don't know the details, but I would suppose so, yes.
Okay, and that new label would also then be incorporated into the ads in medical journals because they have labels attached to them also.
Everything. Ads, if there are ads, new label, package material. When we sell the product itself, there's a label with it. All this gets adjusted.
Okay. Now, when a clinical trial shows a side effect occurring twice as many times assuming that the population numbers are the same. There's 50 people on Paxil, there are 50 people on placebo, but you're seeing an adverse effect that's occurring twice as much on the active medication Paxil as on placebo. Does that indicate that there's a possible association between that adverse effect and the drug?
No, it doesn't. Per se, it doesn't.
Okay. How about if it gets up to 4 times?
It doesn't matter. I mean, you have to look for more than just the ratio in one study. It could be statistically meaningless.
Okay.
You could have 10 times more and it would be meaningless.
Okay. Is that because the population's too small?
It could be population, well, actually, that's unlikely, but it depends on on the statistical power of the finding. In other
Okay.
words, is the finding random? It could
Right.
have, if you do the same trial again, will you get the opposite results? It could be just a random event. Like when you flip a coin, you could have 10 times the same side. Does that mean that you're only going to get the same side? No. If you do another 10 times, you might get the opposite. So you can't really draw any conclusion solely by looking at the risk ratio.
That brings in the p-value, right? That you have to look at
Yeah.
a p-value. And then a p-value helps determine whether or not it's random or, in fact, it's drug-related. Is that correct?
Yes, but don't look at it as a black and white test. It is an important element. It's just one of the elements.
Right. And do you recall what the p-value has to be to take the randomized equation out of, take the randomization out of the equation? Is it 0.05?
0.05 gets to the 95% confidence level.
Is another important part of it looking at what the investigators thought the drug was causing during the clinical trials through the forms such as Exhibit 14, which I gave to you a minute ago?
It's another element to be considered.
Okay. Now, in terms of the Paxil clinical trials, have you ever been given any information on how many investigators have stated that Paxil definitely caused a suicide event? And before we go any further, a suicide event, the way I'm using it here would be a suicide death or a suicide attempt.
No.
Okay. Have you ever seen the information on how many clinical investigators found that Paxil was causally related to any suicide events during the clinical trials?
No.
Okay. Well, let's just say, hypothetically, if 10 investigators said, these are people who GSK hired who believed were competent, said, we believe that this drug definitely caused suicide events during the clinical trials we ran. Would that be a significant factor in your mind to determine whether or not Paxil, in fact, was causing the suicide events?
Not in isolation, even though you have to listen to investigators and carefully assess what they say. In this particular case, in itself, it's a very difficult judgment to make on whether a drug cause and effect, particularly in depression trials where in the background people do commit suicide. So for an investigator, it might be the most famous psychiatrist in the world. How can you judge if a patient commits suicide, whether the patient committed suicide because Paxil had anything to do with it or because the depression, which is in the background, created the problem? You're asking them to fill out a form. They will fill out the form. That doesn't mean the accuracy of their statement is such that we can take it as absolute truth. So I would listen to it, but in isolation, I wouldn't necessarily be swayed by it. You have to look at the totality of the picture to decide those
Right.
things.
Would it be helpful if the person didn't die by suicide, they actually had an attempt, and then the doctor did a challenge, de-challenge, re-challenge, right? That would be helpful information.
I'm going to just declare incompetence on this subject. I don't know.
You were asked a lot of questions in great detail about reports and numbers and documents that you did not participate in. Are there people either at the company now or people who are at the company who are in a better position to speak to those issues than you are?
Probably dozens of them, because they were involved with the nitty-gritty of the data analysis and the clinical trials, which I wasn't. My role was supervisory in nature. Frankly, I'm surprised I'm being asked anything about this issue. I mean, I'm not exactly close to it.
And you weren't close to it back at the time?
No.
It was not part of your job?
It wasn't part of my job. All the data was generated by a division that was not under my authority.
And you were shown Exhibits 8 and Exhibit 9. And is it your understanding from Dr. Whedon's memo of his conversation with Dr. Loughran that the company actually went back and reanalyzed the data that was in the 1991 report, taking out the run-ins and also taking out events that happen on open-label extension and other things?
That's my understanding.
So the company went back and looked at just the controlled portions of the placebo-controlled trials?
Right. And I do remember that whichever way you do it, the conclusion is the same, and that's very important.